organized in a very, very logical way if you are going to write a paper that you want to submit somewhere for publication. That's not usually what you're going to do. So just know that that's kind of the audience, but it is kind of how do you write the paper first, and then how do you format it later, and how do you know, so that's the kind of order it goes in. Most of you have the agenda, but I'll just repeat what it is. We're going to start with marking up the manual with your tabs that you have. And I've got where to mark on these slides, but I'll also talk about them as we go. So manual markup, then we'll talk about elements of a paper and what belongs in a paper. The next hour we will talk about the reference list, which seems to be the biggest kind of hurdle for a lot of students, is how to really construct the reference list. And we'll have plenty of practice and plenty of activities to do during those times. Okay, so as we go through the manual, make note of any questions you have. So some of the tabs I'm going to suggest. I'm just going to say it might be a good idea, and if it's something you need to keep note of, put a tab in there. If not, you don't have to. Others I will suggest strongly. I'm not going to force anybody to do anything, but just some you'll see in bold, and some will be more kind of if it seems like the right thing to do. So types of articles, page 9.
Do you want us to put that on the tab?
Yes, put types of articles on the tab and put that in there. The next one is, if you want, that's not one I bolded. I bolded these there, so it's as you wish. The next one is plagiarism. A lot of you have done this plagiarism module for me that comes from Indiana University, right? That talks about plagiarism, and it gets in a lot of detail about plagiarism. This is the APA kind of brief explanation of plagiarism on page 15. On page 19 are authorship guidelines, and the reason it's at the very top, the reason I noted that is because that seems to be a very confusing factor for many, many students, and at any university I've ever taught at, people have problems with this. Look at what it says, where it says order of authorship on page 19 at the top. Authors are responsible for determining authorship, for specifying the order in which two or more authors' names appear in the byline. So it's up to the people who write the article to decide who's first author, who's second author, who's third author. It's not up to you. You don't get to reorder the authors. The author's guidelines for authorship have to do with how much work someone put into it, whose idea it was, who got the money, like whatever the reasoning is, but it's between those authors what the order is. So when you see authors listed, you can't just randomly decide they belong in some different order. They belong in the order that they're in. So I've got that. Page 20 is the ethics checklist. It's kind of a big little checklist, but it's not one that you necessarily need to always, refer to. It's one more that researchers need to refer to. Page 23 is the elements of the manuscript. And I just put something there, but 23 to 40 pretty much kind of breaks down each element of the manuscript, starting with the title page, going to the abstract, going to each piece. So you can see the elements are title, author's name, author note, etc., etc. Explains each piece of the manuscript there. Okay. And when I'm talking about manuscript, you know what I mean? I mean paper, right? Manuscript paper. One, if you want to tab something with a whole different color tab, something that you definitely want to be able to refer to at any minute, it's the sample papers that begin on page 41. I refer to these a lot when I'm writing, and if I have a little question about, oh, how do you do that again? I can't remember exactly. The sample papers are very, very helpful. There are 3 sample papers here, but if you just mark the first page, you can flip to and find the correct paper that answers your question. If you're wondering, for example, how to do an author note, which you probably wouldn't, but on the title page there's a little thing that says author note. It gives the reference for what section to look in and book to get the explanation. Okay? In APA papers, we use levels of headings. Since and I'll tell you this, I've worked since I was an undergraduate in school through all of my everything. I have actually used every single edition of the APA manual. So I mean, like, I've used the first edition, which didn't even have a name to it, second, third, fourth, fifth. So anyway, they have, over the course of different editions, renumbered the levels of headings. Right now, I think it seems very logical. They're labeled on page 62. Levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the order in which you would, like level 1 is the most important. I think in the 5th edition, level 5 was the most important, and then it went 1, 2, 3, 4. It was strange, but maybe that was the 4th edition. Anyway, these are your levels of heading. The formatting of headings has changed since the last edition. So that level 1 is centered, bold-faced, uppercase, and lowercase headings. In the 5th edition, there wasn't so much of the boldface used. It was more just where it was, but here it tells you whether it's bold, italics, ends with a period, upper, lowercase, etc. Think about headings the same way you think about an outline. Remember when you were in elementary school and you had to make an outline of your chapter in your social studies textbook or some silly kind of assignment like that. So Roman numeral 1 was the most important, and then under that was A. That was, a subheading of 1. That's kind of how this works. So as you do your levels of heading. There are examples and things that kind of recommend to you, if you're only going to use 2 levels of heading, these are the 2 you use. If you're only going to use 3, these are the levels you use. For most papers you will write in graduate school, you will not use more than 3 levels of heading. Most of the time you might just use 2. But just, so you know, there are more levels, and you may have more. Page 65 talks about writing style. One of the important things about writing style in APA style is that it's meant to be clear, precise, use words that everybody can understand. You don't need to, at the very beginning, that very first slide said how to write clearly and impress your professors. What impresses us is not when you know big words, okay? Unless that big word is really necessary to use. But use straightforward language. Use something that, use words that mean what you say and say what you mean. So that's one of the things. It is very appropriate in APA style, in fact called for, to write in first person when you're describing your own work. If you do a study, and most of you in the master's program will do an action research study, right? So you've done this study, you're going to say, I went to the classroom and observed 5 kids' behavior during first period every day. You're not going to say, the author, da 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 da. That's artificial. You did it. Say you did it. So claim what you did. On page 71 is a section on reducing bias. I think in the 5th edition that was a whole separate section of the book. It was in a different place, but they wanted it in the writing style section because as you write, and those of us in special ed have an advantage because we're used to reducing bias in our language. We're used to saying, I teach students with learning disabilities, I teach students with behavior disorders, I teach students who have intellectual disabilities, I teach students with autism. But the rest of the world will say, those autistic kids, right? So yeah, so we want to use person-first language, and in fact APA demands it. That you use person-first language, you use words that don't lend bias in some way when you're describing something. So you want to be accurate with your description, but not add bias. So it's not just with disability, but with other things. Describe at the appropriate level of specificity. Okay? So if you want to say an age group, you want to say ages 65 to 83 instead of over 65. That's an example right out of the book. So you want to be more clear. So again, it's all about clarity, it's all about saying what you mean to say and not saying what you don't mean to say. Guideline 3 is acknowledged participation. Oh, another thing we have in APA studies that we do are, we don't have, and this is back in the olden days, we would talk about, we had so many subjects, right? We don't have subjects. We have participants. We have participants in our studies, so we talk about who the participants are. And then there's reducing bias by, when we talk about gender, sexual orientation, racial, ethnic identity, disabilities, age, etc. So that gives you kind of the whole, not the whole thing, but a nice overview of kind of how to think about reducing bias as you write. Page 77 is grammar and usage. I haven't met anyone, including me, who needs some help with their grammar from time to time. So if you look through here, there are different things. If there's something in particular that gives you a particular bugaboo, you might want to mark that, but grammar begins on page 77. So that kind of takes us through chapter 3. The beginning of chapter 4, so that's kind of like how to write clearly, how to say what you need to say, how to use the right kind of language. When we start with chapter 4, we're talking about mechanics, the physical writing it down and how to punctuate and how to do things like that. So starting on page 87 is one of the big changes that I'm still getting used to with the 6th edition, which is how many spaces you put after a period. And let me tell you, there have been discussions about this. I mean, discussions in the professional world about why did APA make this change, because we all got used to putting 1 space after a period all this time. Now you put 2 spaces after a period. Okay, put 2 spaces after a period. I don't always remember to do that because as I type, I'm just automatically going, to 1 space after a period. But you have to kind of like, if you're old enough, you might have taken typing back in high school, where you put 2 spaces after a period. So you have to kind of go back to that. We're not doing the 1 space after a period like we've been doing for the last 30 years. We're now going to do 2 spaces again. Why? Who knows? But that's just after a period, after other things, or after any kind of end punctuation. So this kind of tells you how to use periods, commas, semicolons, colons, quotation marks. I will say semicolons is one that's hard for a lot of you guys. A semicolon, FYI, is used to separate 2 independent clauses. So if you have a semicolon in the middle of a sentence, that means I can read the first part and it's a whole sentence. And I can read the second part and it's a whole sentence. If I can't do that, I need to put a comma or something else, or a dash or something to separate those 2 clauses if they're not both independent clauses. So anyway, that's explained on page 89. I didn't put it. Numbers begin on page 111. What, do you write out the number 5 or do you write a numeral 5? Do you write out the number 1,345? Like you're writing a check or something. And if you want to write a check, that's a good number to write. Make it up to me. But you want to figure out whether you do, when you do what in terms of numbers, and when you express something in numerals and when you express something in numbers. It's not the cut and dry if it's a number bigger than 10. It's a little bit more complex than that. So that starts on page 111. So that kind of takes you through chapter 4. We're making good progress here. Chapter 5 is about displaying results. You, a lot of times in your papers you write for us, I know I require it in my papers a lot of times, if you've done some kind of intervention with kids, you have to show me some data. And so I want you to show me in a table or a figure or some kind of graph or something. So the guidelines for those begin on page 125. And those are the tables and figures, kind of how to do it and how to type them up and how to format them on your paper. So that begins on page 125. And beginning on page 127 really is where the formatting is. And I would say, to me, if you just put a tab in one of those places or the other, it would probably be sufficient. don't you think? But just so you know, the explanation begins on 125. The formatting information begins on 127. And again, these are not quite as critical for you to tab every single one of these things, but if there's a piece that you want to make sure to tab. 129 is a table layout, and that's a nice picture there that shows you how to lay out the table, what to, how to label it, how to title it, how to refer to it, etc. And page 131 talks about the relation to, actually it's 130, talks about the relation of tables to text. So, and again, you don't need to put a tab in every single one of these pages because then you've got a tab on every page. But just, whichever one makes the most sense to you, I would say put a tab there for tables somehow so you'll know where to go to look for tables. Tables and text, you want to be able to say in your paper, the table shouldn't just appear in your paper without something in your text that says, look at table 3 for, an example of how I cured something. So that page 133 is how the headings go on the tables. Basically, each table needs to have a title, and then it has to have headings above each column in the table that explains it. So that's 133. On page 150, and I definitely wouldn't put a tab on both 150 and 151, it's the same page, but 150 is the table checklist, 151 are types of figures, so it kind of moves into figures. The checklists, and just like the ethics checklist we looked at earlier, they're very useful in terms of did I do everything I was supposed to do. So I definitely would tab those checklists so that you know where they are. If you've got a table, you can look. Is the table necessary? Does it belong? Are all the comparable tables consistent in presentation? Is the title brief but explanatory? Does every column have a column head? It kind of goes through check, 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 check. I did this. Now, let's talk for a minute about the difference between tables and figures. Anybody want to tell me their understanding of the difference between a table and a figure?
Oh, does the table have a special format?
Yeah, a table has a special format, and it's like what we've just been talking about. There's columns, and that's a table. What's a figure?
Is it like a graph?
It could be like a graph.
Subjective.
Well, it's not subjective. I mean, you have
Well,
figures
you
that show
create
things, but it's created. Yeah. It's more like a picture, not a photograph picture, because there's another section of photographs. But yeah, it's more of a demonstration. It's nothing that you want. It's something that can't be put in a table format, but still explains what you're doing. Okay? So a figure, if you think about some figures that are popular in special education, that you see in a lot of publications, and in fact, I say I'm required to draw it in every class at some point or another, is the triangle, right? We use a triangle to talk about RTI, we use a triangle to talk about PBIS, and kind of standard thing. The food pyramid would be another, and that's kind of a three-dimensional kind of figure. So anyway, those are types of figures that are explained on page 151. Graphs, charts, maps, drawings, and photographs. Photographs are a special kind of figure, but they are figures. Figure standards are on page 153, 152, 153, and page 165 is where photographs are explained. And I put that in there as something you might want to tab because some of you guys do use photographs sometimes in your presentations. I've gotten papers from students where they taught a learning strategy to students, and then they wanted to take a picture of the bulletin board that they made that explained the strategy. So they picture it, and the picture goes in the paper. So there's a way to do that. So that's photographs. And then again, the checklist is on page 167. the very useful figure checklist, and it's very similar to the table checklist. But if you're putting in a figure, you want to know about that checklist. So those tables and figures. Now the part that reasoning came, right? Think about chapter 6, which talks about crediting your sources. Okay? You're going to be crediting your sources. When to cite, so on page 169. If you're not sure whether or not you need to cite something, refer to the manual. It will tell you. Page 171 talks about quoting, paraphrasing. My general rule when I'm looking at papers that students write is if it's nothing but a bunch of quotes, all you've done is cut and paste a paper. You haven't really written a paper. I want to know what you think about something, so you can use quotes, but you use them sparingly. Use them when they're important or necessary to make your point. Not, this person said it better than I ever could. That's maybe true, but I still want to know what you think. Page 173 has to do with permissions. You often will not be in a position where you need to get permissions. You need to get permissions when you're quoting an extensive amount of text and you're going to be submitting that for publication, and then the publisher, the person who publishes the journal, wants to know that you have permission to reproduce. So you'll see in a lot of textbooks, you'll see tables and figures and things that will say at the bottom, reprinted with permission from da 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 da. So it's a way for that to happen. Page 175 talks about citation in text, how you do citations, but really, and this is important material to read, but if you look at page 177, this is probably the easiest thing to look at in terms of answering your own questions. There's a citation table, and you can kind of look at that grid and say, where does my citation fall? This is how do you talk about it as you're writing. This is not referenceless. This is like, as you're talking about it, how are you going to say it? What type of citation is it? The first citation, subsequent, how do I do it? Parenthetical information. So this tells you in a very clear way, I think. I really like this table a lot, how to do it. Now, let's say you're reading a paper, reading a journal article, and in this journal article, they're talking about somebody else's study. Right? Like the first part of the article usually is talking about the review of the literature. So it's talking about somebody else's study. And I really want to talk about that study that these people are describing, but I haven't read that study. I'm reading their description of it. That's called secondary sources. Okay? So if you want to mark page 179, because often I think students find themselves in a place where that's what they're doing, is citing secondary sources. It explains how to do it and what goes in your reference list versus what you say in your paper and how those things match up. Okay? So you would say, this has Alport's diary as cited in Nicholson 2003. That's the example in the paper. That means that the person writing the paper wants to talk about Alport's diary, right? But they don't have Alport's diary. Alport's dead and gone from a long time ago. I don't know if Alport is, I'm just making that up. But Nicholson talked about it. So I'm going to talk about Nicholson's interpretation of it. In my reference list, what goes in my reference list? Alport or Nicholson? Give a magic example. No, Nicholson. Nicholson, because that's what you read. That's what you read. So you're going to put that in there. But you are going to talk about, you are going to give the author kind of in the text, Alport's diary, as cited. And then page 181 talks about the order of the references in the reference list. They go into a lot of detail about this person precedes this person, if they've got the same last name but different initials, you know, or if it's this person with another person, and then it's this person by themselves, which one comes first, and how do you kind of order that out? So they have sing precedes, sing and Sadu. Lopez precedes, or it actually seems to be, that's actually a different last name. Lopez precedes Lopez de Molina. Okay, so it tells you those advertising letter by letter. Several works by the same first author. As you are doing your literature reviews, you are going to find that if you're working on a particular topic, a lot of the work is done by a lot of the same people, right? So you're going to have a whole bunch of references that all have kind of the same set of last names, maybe in different orders or different whatever. So it tells you how to do that so that they're in, you know, in a good order and in proper order. And so that can get tricky, but it's all explained here. So that's the reference list. The reference components begin on page 183. And we're going to spend a good hour going through each of those reference components, but just so you know, it starts on page 183. You want to mark that. Going to the next slide now. Is anyone having difficulties keeping up? We still have some time at the end of the hour. I can go back through and catch any pages you didn't get. Page 187 is electronic sources. A lot of times now, here we are in the 21st century. Everything is not on paper anymore. Some journals are only found electronically. Some journals are found electronically and in paper. So we've got electronic sources and how to cite those, and how to give the URL. Okay. And then there's the DOI system, which is also new. That's definitely not, that we didn't even know about DOI in that other edition that you have. It didn't exist. So that stands for document, what does it stand for? Digital object identifier. That's right. Okay, thank you. So it tells you how to cite that, and you will see DOIs in a lot of your paper copies. And if you've got a paper copy, you can add the DOI in there. It's not, to me, it's not necessary, but it certainly gives more information. So that takes you through chapter 6. In chapter 7, which is also another one that we're going to be spending a lot of time on later on this evening, is reference examples. This is the chapter that in my life is the most dog-eared chapter. It's the one I turn to the most, because it has every example you can think of in terms of how references are. It begins on page 193, but let's take a look at it. If you would turn to page 194 and 5, okay? Look at those two pages. You see the types of references there are. They begin at the bottom of page 193, but just so you get a whole view of a bunch, okay? Let's say you're going to be doing a book, a reference book, or a book chapter. That's one of your types. And we're going to do a chapter in an edited book, just something out of the air. See those numbers after chapter in an edited book? What are the numbers? Okay, let's try that again. 24 to 26, chapter in an edited book. Right, 24 to 26. Now, what does that 24 to 26 tell you? No. It tells you those are example numbers. So if you go past where all this list is, beginning on page 198, are the example numbers. So number 1 is journal article with DOI. So if you flip over to 24, which is on page 204, you see 24, 25, 26, those are your book edit books. And then you can pick out which one it is that most closely aligns with what your particular example is. So all the examples are there, but you always want to start at that list that begins on 193 and figure out where you're heading, okay? So it gives you all the different things. So the numbers are right there, examples by type. It's very, I think it's very well laid out once you know what those numbers stand for, okay? Once you know what those numbers stand for. But now you know. So now you know it's laid out for you, okay? So, those are the reference examples. Page 217, I use this as well, the reference to legal materials. In special education, sometimes we do refer to legal materials. In education, sometimes we refer to legal materials. We might want to cite, for example, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004. There's a way to cite that. You need to cite it by its public law number, and there's a specific way. There's a way to cite court cases. So if you want to cite Honig v. Doe, there's a way to cite it. If you want to cite Brown versus Board of Education. So those are, that's one of the reasons I mark that one, is reference legal materials, if you're going to be referring to anything like that. Okay. Publication process, you don't need to really cite, but it is Chapter 8, and just so you know, it's there. But that may or may not be one that you are concerned with. It's one I'm concerned with. Preparing the manuscript is another one where you may not be as concerned, but I might be. But if you look at page, actually you should be concerned about 228, 229, starting at 228 really, is how to set up your paper, how your margins should be, how the spacing should be, how it should be presented. So you do, actually you do want to look at that. So I take back what I said. I thought there was another, there we go. There is a checklist on page 241. It's a checklist for manuscript submission. And like I said, you're not going to be submitting something for consideration for publication, but it's still a good checklist for you before you hand in a paper in your class, right? So you want to know, well, did I do these things? And does it apply in my case? That's another question you have to ask yourself and ask maybe your professor, but that's it. And I used to not have this as a tab, and then one of my students last semester, I think when I did this tabbing of the manual, said, you've got to tab the index because you can find everything in the index, which is true. So the index begins on page 259, and you can put a tab right there.